Well, welcome back to the Christian Core Values and Ethics course by Servant Leaders. We are currently in our discussion about how core values and ethics are formed. And we are on page 14 in your notes. And today we're going to be looking at what happens as core values as we move from core values to ethics. Now, what we looked at in the last video is the fact that we have core values, and depending on what kind of filter we use based on the influences that have come, determine what kind of core values we end up with. And so ethics are formed when we learn what it takes to achieve our goals. And so remember, ethics is the next layer. So we have beliefs, and then core values, and then from core values to ethics, and then from ethics to behavior. And so ethics are formed when we learn what it takes to achieve our goals, or to achieve our priorities or our values. And so we determine a set of rules that we have to live by in order to get to what it is that we value. And so if my core value is to make myself happy, then I must or must not do certain things. And you can come up with a list even in your own mind probably on certain things that you have stated. I will not do this, or I will do this. Sometimes as a young person, you'll say, I will never raise my kid the way that my parents raised me, blah, blah, or statements like that. And but so that becomes an ethic that you live by based on a certain value that you wanted to cling to from your childhood. Now the flip side of that is if we have a value of glorifying God first and foremost, then a whole other set of ethics will tend to be employed, and that will be I must do this or I must not do this in order for God to be glorified. So again, ethics are formed once we determined how it is that we can achieve our goal of making ourselves happy or glorifying God. Now, as we go through life, we test these things, and so we learn as we go, and we try something and find out it doesn't make us happy. So then the ethic begins to apply that I won't do that anymore. I'm going to do this instead, or I'm going to try this instead. Oh, that made me happy, so that's a good thing, and I'm going to apply that ethic to my life. So ethics is just the next step that takes place based on the filter that's filtering out the type of influences we have, creating our core values. If we were to move from core values to behavior, so that's like 2 steps from it, it could look like this. And in your notes, you'll notice an example of one way that this would work. When we move from core values to ethics to conduct or behavior. And what happens in those circles based upon what we've been discussing is I have my priorities. I have the things that I value. Myself or God really comes down to the 2. And then my rules for living then end up being sourced out of my core values. And then when I run into conflict in life, conflict for my ethics, things that cause me to question whether this is the right thing to do or not, I apply my ethic to it, and then my behavior ends up being the result of that. And so my core values and my ethics all have a pretty heavy influence upon the way that I behave. If you look, though, for us as people, we end up with kind of a mixed bag of core values. And as believers in Jesus Christ, that gets even a little bit more mixed, because we end up with a set of sanctified values that we know exist, that the Bible teaches, and so we adopt those ethics oftentimes without necessarily looking at what it is that I value. And or we start to say that is what I value, but I haven't owned them enough yet in my life, and so they're creating conflict with my previous values. It looks a little something like this. I have a set of past values prior to salvation, prior to the engagement with God's Word, whatever it may be. I've got a set of past values that happen. And these are things that make me happy but do not glorify God, or there can be some things in there that are like that. At least my judgment is that way, because I'm perceiving that based on the filter of what makes me happy. The other side of that coin is sanctified values, okay? And these may not make me happy. This says don't make me happy, but they may not make me happy at first because I feel like it's limiting me. But they are things that glorify God. And so I begin to say it's not really about me. My sanctified values are saying it's not about me. It's about glorifying God. Now, when you bring these two worlds together and you start to bring that together in a Christian's life, there are some things that are in common. Like, I want to honor my parents. That could be a past value. Now, why you want to honor your parents may be just because you know that that will relieve you from any type of punishment for not honoring your parents. But if you have a set of sanctified values, your sanctified values are based on I'm going to honor God. I'm going to honor my parents because it glorifies God. Children, obey your parents, for this is right, and it is obedience unto the Lord, right? And so the picture of all of this is that idea of glorified, or my sanctified values are shifting the focus of things that might be in common in both. So I don't lose all of my values, but I do strengthen my values based on them being focused upon glorifying God first and foremost versus making myself happy. That becomes the context by which we work through it. The result of this combination, mixed up core values in our daily lives, is there's struggle and tension in life. Now, Romans 7:15-20, the Apostle Paul talks about the idea that I do not do the things that I want to do, and the things that I want to do I do not do, and the things I do I hate. And he talks about this tension that exists in his life now that as a believer he now has a set of sanctified values being applied and putting pressure on his past values. That carryover of our selfish values into our new life with Christ caused this tension. Galatians 5:17 say they are in conflict with one another. They are at war with one another. There's a battle going on. And so I bring into my Christian world, my new redeemed life, myself, and now I'm having to allow God to redeem even those things in my life so that my values better reflect the values of Christ. Our code of ethics naturally are impacted by those mixed values, and since mixed values and ethics are part of our life, then that's why we end up with the mixed behavior that Paul talks about in Romans 7. I have a set of mixed values and mixed ethics, and there's a mixture of the past and the sanctified values that I should have, and I feel that tension that goes on. It puts a war going on. And oftentimes I'll look back and go, this is not what I wanted to do. I know better than that, but I still acted this way. And that's because I still haven't had my core values totally shaped and molded by God's word and create a solid set of biblical values. And so remember what we said in an earlier principle, you can't just apply rules to adjust behavior. Rules are just a set of ethic. And sometimes as Christians, it's easy for us to just say, okay, I'm just not going to do this anymore, or I know I shouldn't do this, and create a set of rules. But if I don't get to allowing my core values to be affected and changed, things that I hold dearly, I prioritize, I value, then I'm going to end up with a mixed set of behaviors. So principle number 6 that we have in our lessons are this: we must be honest and willing to evaluate our core values if we desire to have a life that reflects Christ. And that's the hard part when it all comes down here, is that we have to humbly approach our lives and to be willing to admit that we have things that are out of whack. And when we do that, we can then God has the ability to shape and mold us because we're allowing him to do so. Now, it sounds weird to say that the sovereign God of the universe, who controls all of creation and has sovereign power over all of those things, needs our permission to help us. Well, he'll shape and mold us as he needs to through the circumstances of life and through his word. but the process is much more enjoyable if we're on board and we allow Him to work. And if our desire is that we reflect Christ, again a priority, I want my life to reflect Christ in this world, then I am willing to let God do what He needs to do in order to make that work. So as you stop to think about putting some of this in practice in our working it out section, we have for you a set of maybe exercises for you to consider. One of those is to just evaluate a specific day. Pick a day of the week that's very memorable in whatever shape or form, whether it's memorable because it had some kind of celebration or some kind of judgment of good day attached to it, or pick a specific day that stood out because there was tragedy there and it was difficult, that kind of day. Run through the questions that are in your notes and just ask yourself some of those questions. What kind of day was it classified to be? What factors led to that? And hopefully, as you start to sort out of that, you might begin to determine, why is it that I consider something good, and does that help me to understand what I'm valuing in that process versus what maybe I should be valuing based on what God's Word tells us. And you don't have to get that far yet, as much as just beginning to ask yourself the question, what does this indicate to me as to what it is I am valuing? The other step in this would be to pray, to spend time praying about your core values, really asking God to shape and mold and point out to you things that He would like to work on in our lives. Here's one thing we truly, totally believe, that God only reveals to us what He's wanting us to work on. He does not unveil everything that needs to be worked on in our lives all at one time. We would not be able to stand up underneath that. Instead, He layers that in through a process called progressive sanctification, and He allows us to be able to understand bits and pieces of things that need to be worked on. And then finally, that idea of reading through the book of Proverbs. We encourage you to read Proverbs 6 through 10, highlight verses that stand out to you, make a mark in your chart, and hopefully have an opportunity to share some of those things that God is pointing out to you through the book of Proverbs. All right, that comes to the end of this section. Look forward to the next video as we continue this process of learning about our Christian core values and ethics.